Operation Sea Spray. So explain to me again why we are spraying biological weapons on our fellow Americans. To save them from biological weapons attack, of course. Operation Sea Spray. All right, unbeknownst to the public, a series of covert experiments unfolded, shrouded in secrecy. From infections to subway tests, hidden truths gradually emerge, inviting inquiry into a concealed history. In October 1950, 11 people in the San Francisco Bay Area became suddenly and violently ill with severe urinary tract infections. Over the course of the next several months, drug rehabilitation facilities noted strange infections around the injection sites of intravenous drug users who were seeking treatment in their programs. One person even died. Doctors noted that all the patients had urine that was tinted slightly red, but couldn't figure out what would have caused it. Since San Francisco is a large city, 11 people and some drug addicts exhibiting similar ailments didn't cause too much concern, but doctors shrugged it off. So doctors shrugged it off as nothing more than a strange coincidence. 2 months later, several people visiting Panama City and Key West, Florida, developed slight difficulties breathing, itchy throats, and persistent coughs. None of the symptoms were bad enough to require medical care, so they just shrugged it off and enjoyed their trip. There didn't seem to be any reason for this to increase in seemingly random. There didn't seem to be any reason for this increase in seemingly random illnesses, leading many people to think that advancements in diagnostic methods, as well as better educated doctors, was the explanation. It wasn't that there was suddenly more disease, authorities thought. It was just that doctors were getting better at finding disease that previously would have been missed. Several years later, police in New York City received several phone calls over the course of 5 days from people who claimed to have seen someone dropping light bulbs onto the subway tracks at several different terminals. Since dropping light bulbs isn't technically illegal, and since police in New York City are usually pretty busy, no one ever followed up on the mysterious light bulb droppers. Random infections, sniffles, and coughs on vacation and subway light bulb drops were, of course, totally unrelated to one another. Or were they? Things aren't always what they seem. After World War II, world governments began to consider the very real risks of biological agents, bacteria and viruses, being weaponized and used to inflict mass casualties on large civilian populations. They may have recognized that with each war, new and terrible ways of killing are discovered, and unfortunately, there are always governments or groups willing to use them to shape the world in the image they imagined is ideal. Seeing the horrors of the Nazi death camps was perhaps a wake-up call to the world. People saw just how much darkness and depravity existed in the hearts of some people, and the terrifying lengths they were willing to go to realize their plans. Dark threats loomed large in the minds of those charged with protecting the citizens of the United States from ambush and annihilation. The military, in partnership with secret government agencies, set out to see just how easy it could be for an enemy to use biological weapons on U.S. soil, and how far-reaching the effects would be if they succeeded. They embarked on a decades-long series of tests stretching from San Francisco to Key West to New York City, covering American cities in bacteria and chemicals without the knowledge or consent of those affected, and without any way to know if their tests would harm the unwitting participants. In San Francisco, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray. The objective was to determine whether or not the United States was susceptible to a biological attack launched from the sea off the coast of the U.S. mainland. A bacterium called Serratia marcescens, which is capable of living in both water and soil for long periods of time, and produces a bright red pigment, was sprayed from U.S. Navy ships along the northern California coast. So was another, Bacillus globigii. The U.S. Navy wanted to see if the bacteria would enter the water system of the Bay Area. The experiment was a success. The bacteria did make its way into the water system, where it circulated long enough for the U.S. Navy to conduct tests and determine that they had indeed discovered a vulnerability and a likely avenue of attack. Although it was assumed that Serratia, I'll just call it SM, was harmless to humans, a week after the test began, 11 people suffered severe urinary tract infections. No connection to the experiment was made at the time, and no one was ever held accountable, even though one person died. The bacteria were also dispersed across the other side of the continent in Key West and Panama City, Florida. Many people reported coughs, urinary tract infections, and respiratory irritation. But because no one knew that testing was being conducted, no one thought the sniffles and coughs were related. A substance called zinc cadmium sulfide, which was once thought to be harmless, but was later found to cause cancer, was sprayed into the atmosphere over America's Midwest. The airborne toxin traveled so far, so fast, that it was found as far east as New York. And the light bulb subway incidents? Yes, that was the government too. For 5 days, covert operatives dropped light bulbs full of Bacillus subtilis onto subway tracks and down vents to measure how quickly it would become airborne and how long it would stay in the subway. By all estimates, the New York City subway system is still heavily contaminated with the bacteria from the original tests. Cui bono? Medical and scientific experiments are necessary to advance us from where we are to our future potential. It takes life-saving procedures from theory to practice and improves the quality of life of all our lives. As vital as experiments and testing are, there is another essential component that sometimes gets overlooked: consent. Consent to medical or scientific testing can be a tricky thing. Not many people are willing to sign themselves up to be guinea pigs in an experiment that could be potentially harmful or even deadly. Likewise, testing new drugs, new medical procedures, and new therapies can be dangerous, but often end up causing more harm than good. Doctors and scientists sometimes find themselves in frustrating situations of having a really good idea or really promising procedure or product, but lacking any willing participants for the next phase of testing and development. Good doctors and ethical scientists, people who respect bodily autonomy and the sanctity of human life and human choice, often put research on hold until they're able to gather enough willing participants to conduct the necessary research. But not all doctors are good, and not all scientists are ethical. For example, or for those people, a lack of willing participants in research experiments doesn't mean that they have to wait. To them, it means they need to find a way around the moral or ethical problems standing in their way. Sometimes groups of researchers sidestep ethical roadblocks because they believe their research is uniquely important and, therefore, exempt from the rules that apply to other researchers. Some of these more aggressive researchers work for the government and are tasked with conceiving of every possible thing that a bad guy might do to cause harm to the citizens of their country, and then trying to figure out how that harm could come and how they can stop it from happening. Although it is good to have a government and military that wants to take proactive steps to protect people, they often justify harming the very people they're supposed to protect in order to hopefully protect more people later. Why does this matter? No one should be subjected to experimental medical testing without their prior knowledge and consent. People should be able to safely and happily go about their lives, riding the subway, going to the beach, walking their dog, or playing with their children at the park, without having to fear that their government is spraying them with bacteria or chemicals that could potentially make them sick. It seems pretty silly to even have to think about that because it's so obvious that it is wrong to test anything on people without consent. But examples of these types of tests are so numerous. For example, between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army conducted open-air tests using biological agents 239 times. That one might wonder if the government operates under the same moral code as most of the rest of us, or if they operate under any moral code at all. One of the important questions to ask when you discover that someone is in power has done something sneaky and terrible is, quote, if they did this and only stopped because they got caught, what else have they done? And what else would they do if they could get away with it? It is responsible to ask questions like this and to look at those in positions of power with skepticism. What we learned. 1. U.S. and foreign governments have conducted secret experiments with live bacteria and cancer-causing agents on their own civilian population, causing harm or even death to people who unknowingly interact with the chemicals or bacteria. When governments say they will stop. 2. When governments say they will stop performing unethical experiments, there is no way to know if they actually do. The people are left to trust the very government that has already deceived and harmed them. None of the people who thought up these experiments or carried them out have been punished for the harm they caused. That's number 3. And number 4, technological advances since the 1950s would make it very easy for the experimentation to take place on civilian populations without their knowledge or consent. Biological testing involving human subjects by the Department of Defense. This is excerpts from testimony to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research. Biological testing involving human subjects by the Department of Defense. Excerpts from testimony to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, March 8, 1977. Colonel Carruth, U.S. Army Chemical and Nuclear Biological Chemical Defense Division, says, the records indicate that there were 19 tests. 19 tests conducted in public domain using biological simulants. I will make a distinction, Senator, between biological simulants and non-biological material. For example, particles and other materials which were released to check dispersion patterns were not living materials. There were 27 of those tests conducted in the public domain. Using which simulant? Senator Schweiker asked. Colonel Carruth responds, Saratia Markison's Senator Kennedy asks, let us review the basic issue that we are talking about here, and that is simulant tests conducted in the public areas. That's what we're talking about here, are we not? Colonel Carruth, the majority of the simulant tests were conducted on military installations. Senator Kennedy, we are not talking about the military installations. We're talking about public domain in those areas. How many did you say were conducted? 19, sir. Maybe you could just, Senator Kennedy says, maybe you could just sort of describe the procedures a little bit, the best of your knowledge, and how they were collected and what actually happened in these areas. What were you trying to deal with? Colonel Carruth responds, the early tests that were conducted were specifically designed to determine the vulnerability, The initial tests conducted and listed in the report were ones in Washington, and there were to test the vulnerability of the Pentagon to simulate biological attacks. They were testing to determine whether or not it could be done covertly, thereby infecting the members of the military service and knocking out our headquarters. The next test that was conducted was one to determine the vulnerability of our Navy ships at sea to a biological attack. A test in San Francisco was to determine whether or not an enemy could conduct a biological attack at sea and infect the population of our cities. I might say that with the simulants used, and the San Francisco test was done in 1950, the evidence that was available at the time indicated that both simulants, both Serratia marcescens and Bacillus gobbligi, were non-pathogenic. Since they were simulants, we did not expect to find any effect on the human population. Senator Kennedy said, I do not think that there is any question in the minds of the American people that open-air testing is basically repugnant to our American system, that in many instances, at least some important instances, tests were conducted in the public domain. I'll get better at this. My boys, I love you so much.